Behind me are 3 black creme tomato plants. I started each of these plants from seed, grew into seedlings, and then brought them out to my garden. But I used 3 different methods in starting those seeds and then transplanting the seedlings, trying to figure out if there is a best way to grow your tomatoes. Join me today as I show you what I think to be surprising results. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I first began this experiment about 6.5 months ago when I first started the seeds indoors. For years, I've started tomatoes from seed and put them in my garden with the understanding that the more often I can transplant the seedling, the better root development I'll have and the bigger the plant will be. The idea being that a tomato plant can grow roots all the way along the stem. So I did it the way I've always done it with one of these plants. I started in a flat, took that small seedling and put it into a small pot, and then as that plant grew, put it into a bigger pot, and then put it into my garden. The other end of the spectrum was to take a pot and just start the seed in that pot with no transplanting of the seedling other than to bring it outside. And the second method was to start a seed and only transplant it once as a seedling. And let me show you how that process worked. I started all of the seeds on the same day, but I did use slightly different methods in how I started those seedlings. For plant number 1 that I started in a cell, I used simply the seed starter mix that I make with peat and perlite. For plant number 2, I started in a small pot. The difference being that I filled most of the pot with my potting soil mix and just used seed starter mix at the top. So the seed germinated in that lighter seed starter mix, but as the roots began growing, they grew into the potting soil. And for number 3, I started in the big pot, but using that same method as number 2. Most of the pot was filled with the potting soil, and the top portion, where the seed was, had the seed starter mix. After I transplanted plant number 1 from the cell to a pot this size, I let it grow. And once some really good true leaves were established, it was ready for the next step. So this tomato has already been transplanted once, and now I'll put it into a bigger pot and bury the stem. So the stem is buried. This is deeper in the pot. Now we'll take this one, put it into a bigger pot. This hasn't been transplanted yet. I'm only going to transplant it this one time. There are 2 tomato plants here. I'm going to go ahead and separate this one out now. Drop this into the pot. I'll go ahead and bury the stem of this one. Just pinch off these cotyledon leaves. And this will be the only time that this one gets transplanted. And then the original plant, I'm not going to do anything with, but I will get in here and just pull out this second plant, and I'll pot that up. So now let's see how these grow. And so both plants 2 and 3 had a couple weeks to grow in this bigger pot. There was another transplanting that took place with plant number 1 that went from the medium pot to a bigger pot. I didn't have any more of these round ones, so I used a square one of the same size. And then it was time to put them outdoors. On planting day, number 1 is looking pretty strong and healthy at about 18 inches to the growing tip. Plant number 2 is not doing as well. It's a little over 12 inches. And plant number 3 is looking pretty good. It measures just over 16 inches up to the growing tip. So now I'm going to plant these in the same way that I did the seedlings. So plant number 3 is not going to be buried any deeper than the level of the pot. So I'll put this into the soil, some really good root development, and I'm only going to put it in so at the level of the soil in the pot is now level with the soil in this garden bed. And I'll trellis this when I get done planting. Now let's move to plant number 2. Plant number 2 will be buried a little deeper. We want some of the stem to be covered by the soil. So we'll go ahead and put this in. And it looks like about 2 to 3 inches of the stem is going to be buried. And it's looking pretty good. Now we'll move on to plant number 1. I've measured 18 inches to put these plants in the ground, so they're all spaced exactly the same distance apart. Now I'm going to dig a much deeper hole and bury plant number 1 so that a good portion of its stem will be covered by soil. Some good root development all the way around. So I'll put this in. These lower leaves are going to end up being buried, so I'll pinch them off, put the soil back into the hole, and it looks like it's going to end up being about 4 inches of this stem is now in contact with the soil. All of the plants were bigger than I prefer to transplant. I don't like to wait until they're 16 to 18 inches tall, but we had unusually cold weather in late spring, so I had to wait about 2 weeks for the soil to warm up enough to be able to transplant those tomatoes into my garden. But it really didn't hurt the plants much, and it did allow me to bury more of the number 1 plant. These plants have now been in my garden for about 3 months, and I'm just a couple days away from harvesting the first ripe fruit. Plant number 1 is still the tallest plant, and it looks to be the biggest plant as well. I haven't pruned it, and I've allowed a number of the branches to spill out. It's got a lot of fruit, a lot of large fruit, but it's not quite ripe yet. Plant number 2 is still the smallest plant. It hasn't grown as much. The fruit set is smaller, but it is starting to ripen a bit. Plant number 3 is still pretty tall, and it's doing pretty well. It's also got a lot of side growth, but it's the first plant to actually have the fruit ripen. There really wasn't much difference in the harvest between the 3 plants. They all looked the same, they tasted the same, and it was the black creme tomato that I expected all along. There was a slight difference. Number 2 didn't produce as much fruit, but it never was as strong a plant. Number 1 and number 3 were pretty close, and I think actually plant number 3 produced more tomatoes than plant number 1. But I was most interested in comparing the root systems of the 3 different plants. And this is what I found. Comparing the roots of the plants, number 1 has a pretty substantial root development. Number 2 has some good roots, but is the smallest of the 3. And number 3 looks pretty comparable to number 1. When you look closer at number 1, you can see this is the initial growth of roots, and then you can see where the stem was buried, and up here there are more roots running off. So a longer portion of the stem that has the roots. You can see some of the same on plant number 2 with the initial roots growing down and then additional roots growing a little bit farther up on the stem. And on plant number 3, all of the roots come from this lower portion. There's nothing at the top, but there's an awful lot of root growth coming from that initial root development. When I put plant number 1 and plant number 3 side by side, it's clear to see that the roots of plant number 3 are noticeably longer. In fact, measuring, it's about 10 inches longer for plant number 3. You may have noticed for plant number 3 that not only were the roots longer, but the stem was thicker, and the plant was pretty sturdy and strong. Plant number 1 obviously showed that there was root development along the stem wherever it was buried, but overall it didn't produce a bigger, stronger plant. And I suspect that's because every time we transplant, we put stress onto that plant. So each time I buried the stem deep, new roots had to grow. And that was at the expense of some of the other more established roots. The plant was putting energy into growing those roots along the stem. But for plant number 2, and particularly for plant number 3, they didn't have that extra induced stress. They were able to grow and keep growing and produce as robust a root system as they could. So is this going to change the way that I start my tomato seeds? Yes, I think it is. I like starting in cells and smaller pots because I can fit them in my grow tower easier. But for the tomatoes that I'm really most interested in, even for tomatoes that might have a longer days to harvest and I haven't been able to grow them, if I start them in the bigger pot, I might be able to grow more varieties in my garden because it appears that plant will fruit sooner and it will still give me a nice strong plant. I was surprised at the results. You may be too. Let me know in the comments below what you think and if it might modify the way that you start your seeds. And if you think others will benefit from this information, well then share this video. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.